Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part D. The Untold Stories of the Kingdom of Israel. Chapter 8. The Untold Story of the historical reality reflected in Elijah's cycle of stories, or why were these stories misinserted into the description of the reign of King Joram, the son of Ahaziah? The Nimshite dynasty ruled the kingdom of Israel for about 95 years, beginning with Jehu's rebellion and his accession to the throne in Samaria for 28 years, probably between 841 and 815, through the reign of Joahaz, probably between 819 and 802, and Joash, probably between 802 and 786, continuing with the long reign of Jeroboam II, who reigned between 786 to 746, and the very short reign of Zechariah in 746 BCE. The geopolitical situation during the time of the Nimshite dynasty is the key to understanding the history of this long period of time. The historical principle that already described in the previous chapter is that the Assyrian Empire was the strongest and leading empire in the entire ancient Near East, and when it rose and grew stronger, only a general regional alliance could stand against it and try to stop it. The individual kingdoms in the Levant, even the largest and strongest among them, didn't stand a chance against the Assyrians when they were not united, and even a regional alliance could not guarantee success. However, at times when Assyria was not present in the area across the Euphrates, usually during periods of this depression resulting from internal problems and the pressure of wars in other parts of the empire, it was possible for the local forces to grow and develop. Thus, historically, times in which Aram Damascus was strong constituted a significant power limit for the kingdom of Israel, and it had to choose between joining a coalition with the Arameans and cooperating with them, usually against a common Assyrian enemy who pressed and threatened from the north, or trying to fight Aram Damascus, sometimes successfully, though mostly unsuccessfully. When Aram Damascus weakened, mostly because the Assyrian pressure from the north, the kingdom of Israel had a great freedom of action, and it could expand the territories of its rule, mainly towards the disputed areas between Aram and Israel in the Gilead and further to the north. Keeping in mind that the key to the regional geopolitical situation lies in the power of the Assyrian Empire, we must remember that during both campaigns that Shalmaneser III made to the region, the campaign of 841 BCE, in which he reached Mount Carmel and even received a tribute from the kingdom of Israel and Tyre, and in the campaign of 838 BCE, when he reached the border of Israel and the Phoenician coast again, he was unable to conquer Damascus, and Hazael managed to hold his own against Shalmaneser and to maintain his rule and power. After 838 BCE, Shalmaneser never returned to the Levant, and the campaigns he made in the following years towards East Anatolia failed to establish an Assyrian hold in the region. The rebellions against Assyria even broke out along the Euphrates, so that Shalmaneser had to leave in 831 BCE to suppress a rebellion that broke out in the kingdom of Unki, Patina, on the Euphrates. In the following years, Assyria ran into severe internal problems. In 826 BCE, a rebellion broke out which lasted for many years, including the first years of reign of Shamshi Adad V, who reigned between 823 and 810 BCE. Wars against Assyria broke out both in the north with the rising power of the kingdom of Urartu, Ararat of the Bible, and in the south against Babylon. As such, throughout Shamshi Adad's reign, there were no military campaigns beyond the Euphrates. This situation also continued in the early years of Adad Nirari III, who ruled between 809 and 783 BCE. Thus, during the entire period that coincided with the years of the reign of Jehu and Joahaz, there was no Assyrian presence in the area. This situation enabled the strengthening of Aram Damascus during the reign of Hazael, who made his kingdom the most important and strongest power throughout the Levant. According to the historical principle mentioned above, the high tide of Aram Damascus was the low period of the kingdom of Israel. This period also includes the conquest of Mesha, the king of Moab, in Transjordan, perhaps even as part of the cooperation between Aram Damascus and Moab against the kingdom of Israel. The Moabite conquest reached as far as the steppes of Moab, east of Jericho, and only during this period could this area receive its name Arvot Moab, the steppes of Moab. Indeed, this period might have been echoed in the prophecies in Isaiah in chapter 15 and 16, and also in Jeremiah in chapter 48. This might be the context through which we can understand the comment in the second book of Kings, chapter 13, verse 20, according to which, and I'm quoting, "So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now, the Moabite conquests reached as far as the steppes of Moab, east of Jericho, and only during this period could this area receive its name, Arvot Moab, the steppes of Moab." Indeed, this period might have been echoed in the prophecies of Isaiah in chapter 15 and 16, and also in Jeremiah chapter 48. This might be the context through which we can understand the comment in the second book of Kings, chapter 13, verse 20, according to which, and I'm quoting, "So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now, bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year." This historical reality of Aramaic rule over Israel is well expressed in the stories of Elisha. In these stories, the Arameans have clear superiority over Israel, whose territory is occupied by Aramean military units. And so, in 2 Kings 5, verse 2, incidentally mentioned that Aramaic troops, and I'm quoting, had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, who served the wife of Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Aram Damascus. According to verse 3, this Israeli young girl told her mistress about the existence of the prophet who could cure Naaman of leprosy. According to 2 Kings 5, verse 7, the letter that the king of Aram sent to the king of Israel with a request to heal Naaman aroused great fear in the king of Israel, and later, according to verse 9, this was no problem for the commander of the Aramaic army, and I'm quoting, "So Naaman came with his horses and chariot and stood at the door of the house of Elisha." According to the description in chapter 6, verses 8 to 10, the king of Aram used to hold ambushes in various places throughout the country, and it was Elisha who knew to warn the king of Israel. I'm quoting, "But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, 'Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Arameans are going down there.' And the king of Israel sent to the place of which the man of God told him. Thus, he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice." Following this, in verses 13 and 14, when the Arameans discovered that Elisha was in Dothan, They went up to besiege the city without seeming to have encountered any resistance on their way there. The case of the siege of Samaria during the reign of Ben-Hadad and the great famine in Samaria also reflects a reality whereby the Arameans had clear superiority over Israel in accordance with the historical situation during the reigns of Jehu and Joahaz. The biblical historiographers knew very well that this reality of the days of Elisha didn't correspond to the situation that existed in the days of Ahab and Ahaziah. And they also knew that Elisha died in the days of Joash, the son of Joahaz of the Nimshai dynasty, since the story of the prophet's death opens with a description of the exciting meeting between the prophet and the king. And this is described in 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 13, verse 14. Now, when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." They also knew that, in contrast to the geopolitical reality that existed during the reign of the Omride kings, Israel was enslaved to Aram in the days of Hazael and during the early reign of Ben-Hadad. In fact, these things were written explicitly several times. For example, in the 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 10, verses 32 to 33, describes that, I'm quoting, "In those days, Yahweh began to cut off part of Israel. Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel, from the Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manashites, for Aroer, which is by the valley of the Arnon, and the Gilead and the Bashan." These words were related to the theological evaluation of the days of Jehu in verse 31, according to which Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of Yahweh, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He didn't turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin. The same connection between the theological assessment of the days of the reign of Joahaz, the son of Jehu, as described in the 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 13, verse 2. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and followed the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. He didn't depart from them. This is connected to the enslavement of Israel to Aram described in the next verse, verse 3. I'm quoting. "And the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, king of Aram, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael." End of quote. Using the same theological historical method of judgment, the next verses describe the direct connection between obedience to God and the pressure of Aram. And this is in verses 4 to 7, and I'm quoting. "Then Joahaz asked Yahweh, and Yahweh hearkened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Aram oppressed them. Therefore Yahweh gave Israel a savior, so that they went out from under the hand of the Arameans, and the children of Israel dwelt in their tents as formerly. Nevertheless, they didn't depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin, but walked in them. And the Asherah also remained in Samaria, for there was not left to Joahaz an army of more than 50 horsemen and 10 chariots and 10,000 footmen. For the king of Aram had destroyed them and made them like the dust of threshing." This description also shows the great weakness of the Israelite army during the reign of the kings of the Nimshai dynasty until the reign of Jeroboam II. Likewise, the situation is also described later, and I can read from 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 13, verses 22, and then 24 and 25. "Now Hazael, king of Aram, oppressed Israel all the day of Joahaz. When Hazael, king of Aram, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his stead. Then Joash, the son of Joahaz, took again from Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken from Joahaz his father in war. 3 times Joash defeated him and recovered the cities of Israel. The difference between the historical background of the days of Elijah and that of Elisha is also expressed in the relationship between the prophet and the king, as well as in the prophet's basic standing in regards to the royal house. Elijah had acted as a persecuted opposition to Ahab and his dynasty in the historical and religious context of the penetration of Baal cult into Israel in the days of Ahab. Elijah fought this to the end. In contrast, the stories about Elisha reveal a figure of a prophet who worked alongside the king. The stories indicate that the king adored the prophet. Indeed, in the second book of Kings, chapter 8, verse 4, I'm quoting, the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, "Tell me all the great things that Elisha has done." It was the king's admiration for the prophet that led to the solution of the Shunammite problem and his order, I'm quoting in verse 6:2, "Restore all that was hers, together with all the produce of the fields from the day that she left the land until now." Moreover, according to the second book of Kings, chapter 6, verses 8 to 10, Elisha helped the king of Israel and revealed to him the location of Arameans lying in wait for the Israelite army. And when he heard that the king had torn his cloth and was frightened by the book he had received from the king of Aram, the prophet sent him a reassuring message, according to which, and I'm reading from the second book of Kings, chapter 5, verses 7 to 8, he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you rent your cloth? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." Elisha's great influence in the royal court and the king's adoration for him is also expressed in the story whereby before the prophet's death, as we read it before from chapter 13, verse 14. Joash, king of Israel, went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." Later, the prophet prophesies victory for the king over the army of Aram, in verses 15 to 18, and even became angry with the king for not fulfilling his instruction exactly as he had told him to do. And this is in verse 19. Then the man of God was angry with him and said, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times, then you would have struck down Aram until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Aram only 3 times." Although this historical reality, which is expressed in the stories of Elisha, was clear to the biblical historiographer, who repeated it several times in the context of all the first kings of the Nimshite dynasty, Elisha's story cycle was not placed in its appropriate historical chronological place, and its beginning was tied to the ascension of Elijah in whirlwind to heaven, as described in second book of Kings, chapter 2, verse 1, immediately after the closing formula of Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, in second book of Kings, chapter 1, verse 18, and before the opening formula of Joram, the son of Ahab, in the second book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 1. Thus, according to the surface level reading of the historical description, Elisha acted in the days of Joram, the son of Ahab. As mentioned previously, Elisha was also tied to the initiative for Jehu's rebellion, which the previous chapter dealt with. Many researchers who saw this problematic literary reality hypothesized that the placement of this series of stories was intended to tie Elisha to Elijah, to connect the two prophet cycle of stories into one sequence, and above all, to present Elisha as Elijah's successor. The emphasis in the story of Elijah's ascension to heaven in 2nd book of Kings chapter 2 is on the transfer of the spirit of prophecy from Elijah to Elisha, and on the appointment of Elisha as Elijah's successor. The connection between the two prophets and between the two cycles of stories appear to be a literary fact that was more central and stronger than the historical content of the two stories and the different reality that emerged from them. A possible assumption is that the biblical historiographers received the stories of Elijah and Elisha as one written literary text, which included an edited collection of stories about the two prophets. The prophetic stories that were transmitted among the prophet's admirers for many years as oral traditions were committed to writing at some point, probably as early as the 8th century BCE, before the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, and the biblical historiographers knew them as a written text in one scroll. We might assume that Elisha's admirers played an important role in the collection and writing of the sources, and that in emphasizing the importance of the prophet and his central role, Elisha was presented as the successor of Elijah, and the story of Elijah's ascension to heaven and the transfer of the spirit of prophecy to Elisha was the point of connection between the two prophets. This scroll, which included a collection of stories about the two prophets, was, in actually, the source of Elisha's legitimacy as Elijah's successor. Because the biblical historiographers didn't have many additional sources on the history of the Omrides and that of the Nimshides, many details were taken from these stories, which were central in shaping the characters of the kings and describing the main events that took place in their days. Since the cycle of Elijah's stories is closely related to Ahab, the historiographers decided to place Elisha's story cycle in the days of Joram, Ahab's son. Indeed, they may have found support for this placement of Elisha in the story of the campaign against Moab in the days of Joram, as well as in the description of Elisha's central part in Jehu's rebellion. The conclusion is that here, too, the lack of information, the paucity of sources, and their character as a collection of prophetic stories is what led to the, perhaps intentionally, incorrect placement of Elisha's story cycle. This placement also fits well with the ideological trends of the historiographers who use the connection forged between these stories to convey the conceptual message about the causality behind the historical events. This placement of the story created a large and unbridgeable gap between the historical reality that can be reconstructed on the basis of the analysis of extra biblical sources versus any reconstruction based on a critical analysis of the biblical text and the descriptions in the Book of Kings. Apart from the information from the prophetic stories, the analysis of which raises, as mentioned, important information about the history of the days of Jehu and Joahaz, there is almost no additional historical information in the description of the days of these kings, evidence of the paucity of the information and perhaps also the lack of interest by the biblical historiographers in the history of the kingdom of Israel at that time. Beside the description of the rebellion, for all the 28 years of Jehu's reign, only one piece of information is given in the book of Kings, and this is in the second book of Kings, chapter 10, verses 32 and 33. In those days, Yahweh began to cut off part of Israel. Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel from the Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Menashites, from Aroer, which is by the valley of the Arnon, and the Gilead and the Bashan. These verses do not seem to contain detailed historical information, and I accept the assumption that these details do not reflect the reality of the days of Jehu. After all, The Arnon stream, Wadi Mujib, is located far south of the border of Israel, and the Bashan was not at all part of the kingdom's borders. This description uses schematic terms and place names that are known from lists and other biblical historical descriptions, and the information about the increasing power of the Arameans in the days of Jehu seems to have been supported by the biblical historiographers with information from this period which they could have taken from their own sources. Only a short description is given of the years of Joahaz's reign, and this is in Second Book of Kings, chapter 13, verses 1 to 9. And in it, apart from the opening and closing formulae, there is a theological explanation for the slavery of Aram and a brief description of the introduction to the salvation that came later, and I can read from verses 3 to 5. And the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, king of Aram, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. Then Joahaz asked Yahweh, and Yahweh hearkened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Aram oppressed them. Therefore Yahweh gave Israel a savior, so that they went out from under the hand of the Arameans, and the people of Israel dwelt in their tents as formerly. Following this, the great weakness of Israel in the days of Joahaz is described in verse 7. For there was not left to Joahaz an army of more than 50 horsemen and 10 chariots and 10,000 footmen, for the king of Aram had destroyed them and made them like the dust at threshing. This weakness is also explained by the theological reasoning expressed in the previous verse, in verse 6. Nevertheless, they didn't depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin, but walked in them, and the Asherah also remained in Samaria. The description of this critical low point in Israel's history is immersed in the set of stories about the prophet Elisha, and a few of the long chapters taken from the prophetic stories refer to the geopolitical reality that existed in Israel in this era. Apart from the basic information that the biblical historiographers found in the lists of kings, they seem to have drawn all the other information from the prophetic stories. And despite the important information contained in these stories and the historiographers' understanding of this information, they preferred to insert the Elijah stories before the days of Jehu and Joahaz. This decision stems from ideological and literary consideration, and as well as the desire to keep these stories close to the written source from which the information was drawn. As mentioned, this insertion of the story into the place that the biblical historiographers decided to locate it created a large and unbridgeable gap between the historical reality and the description in the Book of Kings, evidence that from the point of view of the historiographers, historical reliability, accuracy in details, and the correct placement of the facts were not the most important considerations. The geopolitical reality changed during the days of Joash, son of Joahaz, and the grandson of Jehu. During this period, Aram became weaker and Israel could become stronger. Regarding Joash, the historiographer had two clear and explicit sources which testify to the great salvation from the Aramean yoke, alongside Israel's consolidation into the strongest kingdom and leader of the entire region. Unlike previous periods about which they had no information, and unlike the parts of the story which reviewed in this chapter, where we show that the historiographer chose to insert the prophetic story in a historically incorrect place, the information about the days of Joash was clear. Moreover, the connection that the information had to the days of Joash was also clear. Yet, the historiographer consciously and purposefully chose to disconnect this information from the description of Joash's reign, although the two stories were inserted later and the king's name appears in them clearly. Why? We'll find out in the next chapter.